And today's speaker is Dr. Lila Maroon, and her title is Anti-Semitism in EDI Discourses in Canadian Higher Education. How did we get here, and how can we move forward? And allow me just to read quickly your bio. So
we can skip the bio.
It's really relevant to today's talk. So because we have visitors also from outside the faculty, and I just want to, So Dr. Lila Maroon is an assistant professor in the Faculty of Education at San Francisco University. Her research draws on critical theories to highlight issues of equity, anti-racism, and inclusion in education. It focuses on structural and institutional barriers to access and success in higher education, with a particular focus on teacher education. Lila has worked as an educator with diverse students and communities in multiple contexts. Her current SSHRC-funded projects explore the barriers facing Punjab international students in Canadian higher education and a comparative study of the recertification processes of internationally educated teachers in Canada and Europe. She is further interested in EDI policies and action plan in higher education, asking what is included and what is left unaddressed. So that is today's talk with you. Thank you, Lila.
Thank you, and thanks for having me here. And I also want to start by acknowledging that we gather on the unceded and traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, the Coquitlam Nation, and living here on this land in peace and reciprocity. I wish the same for the people suffering now in Israel and Palestine, and I wish peace and safety for them. And so, so I want to talk about anti-Semitism and how it is being addressed and included or not in EDI discourses. And, you know, this is a very complex and contentious topic. So, you know, I'll try to give some kind of a brief overview. I won't be able to do justice to all the complexity, but I hope to give you enough to think about, and then we can have a discussion. So I'm going to talk a bit about EDI in Canadian higher education and how it addresses anti-Semitism. I want to suggest a few ways why I think we see a problem in lack of recognition of anti-Semitism. I want to talk a bit about the impact and suggest how we can move forward. And I just want to be transparent of what is not on the plan and why. I'm not going to talk about politics. This is not my areas of expertise. I also not going to talk about the current war in Israel and Gaza. I find it heartbreaking and the loss of civilians' life and suffering and tragedy. But what I'm going to talk about is the problematic connection between those areas and events in the Middle East to the rise in anti-Semitism targeting Jewish people. So this is my focus. And I'm also not going to talk about the campus protests because this is another huge issue. And again, I would just say that I support activism, protest, civil disobedience, and the things that I'm worried about is where those things are embedded with anti-Semitism terminology and actions. So I'm going to limit my talk to those areas. So just, you know, many of you know, but just as a brief overview. So EDI in Canadian higher education, so stand for equity, diversity, inclusion. And equity is about removing systemic barriers and ensuring access and success in higher education for students and faculty and staff from all walks of life. Diversity is about recognition, the different positionalities and background of members of higher education institutions, and inclusion is about creating campus environment that acknowledges the humanity and the diversity and makes everyone feels like they belong and can bring their full humanity. And EDI has become, the prevalent framework to address issues of social justice and equity in Canadian higher education. There is a focus on issues of anti-racism and decolonizing, and this makes sense, keeping in mind the history of exclusion and marginalization of people of color and the ongoing legacy of settler-colonialism in Canada. And we also know that there is, as you can see here, this is a survey of Universities Canada. Many institutions, so almost 100%, are in the process of developing EDI policies and action plans. And you can see that, again, within the same survey, there is a specific focus on implementing EDI policies and strategies, inclusive culture on campuses, and hiring of people from underrepresented represented groups. So, of course, we know that there is a lot of critique talking about that those EDI priorities are more performative than leading to real structural changes, and there is a lot more work to be done. However, we do see some changes in adopting EDI as priorities in higher education. Yet, when we look at references to antisemitism and Jewish identity across EDI policies and action plans, we see that there is not much reference. Those are just two examples. One of them is COUT, or Canadian Association of University Teachers. And this is from their resource about self-identification survey. And you can see that under the category of race and ethnicity, there is no reference, there is no indication of self-identify as Jewish. Although many Jewish people do not see themselves as fitting under the category of white. Another example here is, and this is from a medical faculty at UBC, that have publicly resigned, and he mentions that looking across UBC faculty policies and action plans, there are no references to antisemitism, and this is typical across many institutions. Here at SFU, while we do have some resources and references to antisemitism, you can see I gave here 3 examples. So you can see sometimes it is not named when there is references to other forms of oppression and systemic oppressions that are being named, such as racism, Islamophobia, and anti-Asian racism, etc. You can see in the middle example, so antisemitism is hate, which is very vague and open, and then it immediately goes on to extend to all faith background and ethnicities. So there's not pause on antisemitism. And just to put it as a reference point, you see that, in the bottom example, when there is reference to anti-Black racism, it is very clearly defined as systemic racism and oppression. So there is a difference in how we talk about systemic oppression and racism to the reference or omission of antisemitism. So I want to suggest 3 main reasons. And I'm going to make them, I'm starting from the easiest one and make it more and more complex. And again, I'm saying that all of those there's a lot to talk about. So, I'll just try to put, kind of an invitation to think more about it. So first of all, the construction of antisemitism is religious-based discrimination. So whereas Jewish people see themselves as people, which means that have shared culture, language, history, religious texts, rituals, also big diversity. It's not just one unified group. But within the North American context, Jewishness have been conceptualized as a form of religious. You can see that within the recent Statistics Canada survey, this is not how most Canadian Jews see themselves. Many see Jewishness as a form of ethnicity or cultural affiliation. Many Jewish people like me, not religious at all, yet still feel and see themselves as Jewish. This is also clear in Canadian law, in which antisemitism is categorized under religious discrimination. So you can see this chart that antisemitism is reported under hate crimes motivated by religion. And so there is two problems when it's come to EDI with this. First of all, in most cases, nowadays Canadian higher education, EDI typically does not center on religious-based discrimination. So those things are on the margins. They're not core to the EDI discourses. And this is not to say that this is not an issue. For example, for those observant Jews, they face for years systemic issues. For example, the start of the fall term on many Jewish high holidays, or the exam period in the second term that falls a lot of time on Passover. So this is not to say that this is not an issue, but for me, this is not the main issue that I want to address. The main issue is that it creates this false cut between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. And it makes it easy for people, and I put myself within this group, that works within critical theories, that participate within overall Canadian academic progressive institutions, to say anti-Semitism is not our problem. It is something that emerges from conservative right-wing discourses. And it's easy then to say, oh, this is not okay, and push against anti-Semitism. However, I think that actually within the Canadian context and within Canadian higher education institution, what I'm more worried about is the messy places in which anti-Semitism emerge in this conflation with anti-Zionism and progressive tendencies. And I will just make clear here, I don't think that any anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, not at all. It's a completely legitimate position. There are Jewish people who are not Zionists, and there are Zionists who are not Jewish. But the places I think that we need to address, that I'm worried about, is the anti-Semitism that does emerge from this spot. As you can see, this image from the encampment of U of T, it says, all the Zionists are racist, or all the Zionists are the terrorists. So those are the things that I want to address. And maybe I will just add here that I'm quite aware that, especially within the context of the US, there are, Republicans, policymakers having the time of their life now, going after academic institutions and using anti-Semitism as a tool to go after universities. I don't think they're really deeply committed to anti-Semitism. Some of them probably are anti-Semitic themselves. So it's not that this is not something to be worried about, but I'm going to kind of like focus now on anti-Semitism coming from those left circles, because I think this is where I am positioned. So just to do a very, very brief introductions, and again, those are complex things to discuss. So I'm worried about this new anti-Semitism that emerges at the intersection of anti-racism and settler-colonial discourses. And within this North American context, there is, two prevalent discourses, definitely within the US, also in Canada. We talk a lot about whiteness, white privilege, and anti-Black racism. And again, those are very important frames to address the history and legacy of slavery and systemic racism within North America. And in the US and more in Canada, we talk a lot about settler-colonialism. And this is part of the commitment of addressing the legacy of colonialism and commitment to indigeneity and decolonizing. However, both those discourses are insufficient and incomplete to understand Jewishness, the Jewish condition, nor the situation in Israel-Palestine. And when they used in a simplified and popularized way, as we see more and more, I think because of all the misinformation and social media, etc., they create this false binary between Jewish people as the embodiment of white privilege and colonial oppression, and Palestinians as racialized and indigenous. And I think this binary, it's not only inaccurate, it also feeds into new forms of anti-Semitism. And I just want to kind of like start with this quote, which I think it's very relevant. It talks about anti-Semitism is actually a shape-shifting protein creative force. Anti-Semitism has managed to reinvent itself multiple times throughout history, each time keeping some of the old tropes around while simultaneously creating new ones adapted to present circumstances. In each iteration, anti-Semitism reflects the ideological preoccupation of the moment. In anti-Semitic discourse, Jews are always made to exemplify what a given group of people consider to be the worst feature of the social order in which they live. So I think within our current discourses, and again, on the left, society is very polarized, but on the left, within my circles, the thing that we're more worried about the most is those anti-racism and settler-colonialism. And I'm worried about how they feed into those new forms of anti-Semitism. So let's just break it down a bit. So the construction of Jews as white privilege. So there is been a process of legal and cultural whitening of Jews within the context of North America. Now, this is not to ignore the fact that Jews definitely has gained some privileges from their ability to assimilate and integrate in this mainstream, quote unquote, North American cultures. And those possibilities were not open to members of other racialized groups. So Jews has definitely gained some privileges from this ability. However, this also feeds into some, anti-Semitic tropes or stereotypes of Jews as form of model minority, and also put them in a position that is not really in and not really out. So in this in-between spaces in which they can be targeted by, on one hand, theories or conspiracies from the right as kind of like the great replacement theory, but also pushed against from the left as a form of white privilege. Whereas most, Jewish communities did keep their distinct identities and saw themselves as a separate and distinct group that cannot be absorbed within, the white, whatever majority. And so it both overlooks the self-identification of Jewish people, and it also, doesn't acknowledge the great diversity of Jewish people. While in North America, many Jewish people are from Ashkenazi, so Eastern Central European background. In many other places, definitely in Israel, the majority of the Jewish people are from Arab, Middle Eastern, North African countries. So even if you want to look at skin pigmentation, they're not white. However, I think more important that in critical discourses, as you know, we don't talk about race, as skin pigmentation, nor as biological construct. We talk about it as not as a biological distinction, we talk about it as a form of social construct. And if you think about race as a social construct, looking at the history of Jewish people with marginalization, exclusion, and genocide, they cannot be, put aside from anti-racism discourses and be absorbed into whiteness. And so the last thing that I want to say here is, I don't think it's useful to participate in any form of oppression Olympics. I don't think Jews need to hold the sign of the victim of all victims, and I don't think it's useful, productive, or accurate. But I think that we need to acknowledge that anti-Semitism is not following the typical path of other racialized groups, where hopefully there's kind of like exclusion and more integration. With Jewish people, many times when they thought they were most integrated and most included, this is when they face the most, the most extremes form of exclusion and marginalization. So we cannot fit anti-Semitism into other forms of patterns that might fit other groups. So the outcome of this form of this discourse, it overlooks the history of Jews in Canada and in Canadian higher education. So Jewish people were subjected to quotas, could not buy houses in many places, and as we know, none is too many were excluded from coming to Canada during World War II. But if we look at our curriculum and resources, we hardly ever talk about this within the context of Canadian history. You can see the bottom example. This is from my son's grade 5 social studies curriculum. And he told me that they study a unit about what has Canada done wrong. So I asked him, did you talk about Jewish people? And he said no. So I went into the BC government curriculum site, and you see that there is a long list of wrongs that Canada has done, but no mention of Jewish people. This is very typical also in our courses. So for example, Education 400, the teacher education course, we use a resource called 150 Years of Racism in British Columbia. There is 0 references to anti-Semitism there. And what it creates, this kind of omission, it feeds into discourses of privilege that feeds into then old anti-Semitic tropes. And nowadays we hear a lot of Jewish people taking control over universities, intervening with academic freedom, trying to control discourses. The top example, this is from the academic women listserv, and you can see that some people were very worried about people sneaking the IRA, so the International Holocaust Remember Alliance definition of anti-Semitism into a SFUFA meeting, and that it seemed that some Zionist faculty were pushing IRA to more in an attempt to silence dissent, right? So at least, on a positive note, I heard that this SFUFA meeting had like the, high record of attendance. So I guess we supported the union in some way, but you can see that this kind of terminology is being reproduced in this university. Okay, so, and this is definitely the most complex topic. So I'll just again go and touch on it very briefly. So settler-colonial discourses and framing became very prevalent in how we look at the history of Canada. And I think it is a useful framework to look at Canadian history, including higher education and education institutions in Canada. However, when it is being kind of like put to Zionism and the formation of Israel in a simplistic way, it overlooked the long and very complex history of the land, right? And this is not to say, by the way, that this is not legitimate. I think settler colonial tools are legitimate framework to look at the history of the region. I think it's definitely highlights some things that I at least think that they are correct. And I think that they are definitely should be included in how we look at history, but they're not the only framework. And they're not the only way to look at the history. So it's not that they're inherently wrong, but they are inherently incomplete. And if you only look through this frame, there are only some things that you're going to see. And what this frame creates is a false dichotomy between Jewish people as the embodiment of oppression, so those white colonial forces, and Palestinians as indigenous to the land. And this kind of like, and these constructions fails to acknowledge the historical, cultural, religious ties of Jews to the land, dating back the millennia, including continuous presence in this land. And it also doesn't acknowledge that there could be places that in which there are coexisting claims for to indigeneity in Israel and Palestine, which are not which can coexist. And I think what it feeds is really create this form of, it gives rise to this form of negating anti-Semitism. And, I'll just do a very kind of like, because definitions are important, but they're also complex. So I'll just say very briefly that Zionism is, I think most Jewish people understand it, and in the most kind of like narrow definition is the acknowledgement that Jewish peoples deserve to have self-determination and sovereignty in some parts of the lands that we call Israel, historic Palestine. Now within Zionism, there are a lot of different traditions, and some of them had heated discussion between how this should look like, politically, culturally, religiously, nationally. There was never an agreement. And there were people that were highly critical for the Zionism within Jewish people, and not only, also very strong critiques who are not Jewish, which is completely fine. And also people that became more and more worried and critical to the form of Zionism that has kind of like took hold as Israel has progressed, and especially after the 67 war. And I share a lot of this critique. Yet what I see that is as problematic is this rise of form of negating anti-Zionism. That really it's not about critiquing, it's about positioning this whole form of Zionism as a colonial European project, and therefore Israel is a state born in sin, and therefore it should not exist in any shape or form. And I'm worried about this discourse for two reasons. By the way, I'm not saying that we cannot say it and we cannot debate about it. I'm not trying to silence any form of speech. I'm just worried about two things about this discourse. One, I think it feeds hate and dehumanizing of Jewish people and Israelis, and see them as humans and diminish their suffering. And you can see this tweet at the bottom, which made me leave Twitter for good. And you can see that this is October 7, and it says post-colonial, anti-colonial, and decolonial are not just words you hear in your EDI workshop. And this is October 7. And the second thing that I'm even more worried about is that, you can like it or not, but between the river to and the sea, there are some 14 million people living, and they're not going anywhere. Palestinians are not going to go and forget and go to Lebanon or Egypt. Israelis, Jews, as much as some people might want to imagine it, not going back to Poland or Morocco or Germany. They're living there together. And I fear that those discourses that negating anti-Zionism, what they actually do, they move us away from the ability of those people who are there and here and trying to find ways to live together, to see each other's pain, to humanize each other, and to strive for solutions. And the solution, hopefully, probably will be at first peace between two states, maybe even cold peace, but peace. And then maybe we can imagine other future. But at this point, those discourses, what they do, they feed into the extremist voices on both ends. And and I think they take us further away from the ability to live together in this region. So I want to talk about the impact. Okay. Okay, so I want to talk a bit about the impact and then, maybe ways to move forward, and then I'm going to open it here and happy to engage with you. So you can see here that SFU says that SFU University is committed to creating diverse, equitable, and inclusive community where all feel welcome, safe, accepted, and values. So I want to say, first of all, that, at least I don't think, and hopefully none of us think, that we're talking about safety in a way, safety from being challenged by complex ideas and disagreement and discussions. I think this is what makes us human. We don't have all the answers, and we need to be willing to step into risky discussions. But I think what EDI does is really talk about impact. And it talked about how can we be engaging in those difficult spaces while still feeling that we are being seen as humans, that we are included, that we have space. And, I'll speak on my behalf. I think this is the case of many, many Jewish faculty that I know. I don't think that this is the way that many of us feel since October 7th. And I can show you one, and for me, one kind of like the most stark example is those, people that tear posters of the hostages, because what makes one look at people of civilians and kids and elderly and women and men and just tear down the poster, right? So this is really a form of dehumanizing. This is inability to see someone else's pain. And just within the context of SFU, so I'll give you some examples of the impact of those things. And again, I would just maybe say here that I wouldn't censor any of those. I think all of them should be allowed in institutions and in society. I just find it very peculiar that a lot of my colleagues and us that usually are very sensitive toward issues of inclusion and belonging, all of a sudden become like the strongest supporters of academic freedom. When it's come to the issues of anti-Semitism. So kind of like just the discourse has flipped, and not that, academic freedom is not important. It is really important. I'm just curious to hear how come it became important now when the people in questions are Jewish people. And so I'll just give you a few examples of signs and terminology on campus. So this is from the peak, and you cannot see it here, but at the poster at the back, there is from the river to the sea. And again, I'm not saying that this is illegitimate. We can argue about what it means, but I'm talking from EDI perspective at the impact of what is the impact of a Jewish student that is part of SFU and see this sign, and is there a way to support the completely just Palestinian cause while not excluding other people while doing it? The second example is, a lot of those anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism workshop that emerge all over the place. And I thought that this one is quite interesting, although it's by all means not unique, because there is a list here. You cannot see it's like, small prints, but it's a list of, 40 organizations. All of them are Middle Eastern and Muslim studies that do a workshop on anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. And this, we would never see it on other issues, in which people from the outside explain to people on the inside what they need to know about themselves. And while we have there, if you see, there are some Jewish speakers there, but there are a very specific Jewish voices. So Jewish voices for Palestine, faculty, what is the name of the faculty? People of Palestine, there's all those groups. I'm not saying that they are not legitimate. I'm not even saying that they are not important. And I don't think that we need to define who is in and who is out as speak on behalf of the Jewish people. There is enough space in the world to speak. But I am worried from the tendencies of all those kind of like critical theories and critical and progressive circle to adopt those voices and put them in and check the inclusion box, because this is not how we do inclusion in any other circles. So, and I think this also leads to, critical, again, education one-on-one, the notion of allyship, that if someone is being targeted, they're not standing there on their own. They have people standing them, supporting them, taking part of the burden. This is not what we see. So I'm standing here, and I think many of us just have a full-time job on the side of our desk, because no one is standing, right? And maybe in some private emails, maybe, no one public, right? So I think this is something that we need to think about. And the last example, you can see the motion of Israel-Palestine and SFUFA, which again, not saying that it's illegitimate to put motions, but I just want to highlight that it starts, whereas since October 2023. This is a starting point. So this is the union that represents me. What happened in October 2023? And can we make a motion that can call for ceasefire, peace, or whatever, while acknowledging that there is pain that is also being, suffered by Jewish and Israelis? So I want to kind of like suggest some ways to move forwards. And, those are definitely not, we can think about many more, but some ways that I think can be useful. So reach out to Jewish students, faculty, and staff, listen to the diverse experiences, and keep in mind that the principle of nothing about us without us cannot be overlooked when we talk about antisemitism. Engage with the diversity of Jewish life, included in campus events, spaces. And it is troubling that many Jewish people now, especially those that carry Jewish marks or religious marks, they don't want to be visible on campus because they might be targeted. And I think for me, even more important is engaging with diverse perspective and positionalities and model dialogue across difference. I think the ability, drawing on Hannah Arendt here, the ability of deeply engage with each other and see each other's humanity, even when we disagree, this is what makes us human. So those echo chambers in which, and I keep on going to those talks because I'm waiting to find the one in which people will sit and talk together across difference, and it's nowhere to be found. And I would love to stand together with people and call for ceasefire and peace and join hands. And most of the places that I see around, and they are being fed in universities, are divisive and separate. And if we cannot get it right in universities, so where is it going to happen? On Twitter? So act systemically to address antisemitism in EDI policies and action plans. It is not there. Believe me, I checked, and I think we need to include it. And we need to call out antisemitism like any other group memberships. This is, you are born Jewish, you are born Israeli. It doesn't carry with it inherent shame. Even if you are, God forbid, Zionist, you should not be excluded and harassed or speak on behalf, and you're not representative of Israel, and you're just a person with positionality, like we say in EDI discourses. And we need to teach about the history and legacy and contemporary manifestation of antisemitism, because I think really part of the problem is that students know nothing. And it makes me very worried when I see calls saying, oh, social studies teacher, go and attend this talk about anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. Because if you know nothing, and this is what you know, I don't feel comfortable that you're going to teach my kids and see them as humans. So I think those are all kind of like things that we need to consider. And lastly, just to end with hope, although I'm not very hopeful, but we're in the business of education, and there is no education without hope. So I want to say that there are some people who try to do, who try to navigate this complexity So I just want to recommend, there is a group called Standing Together of Jews and Palestinians and Israeli. They're trying to imagine peace and safety. There is an organization called A Land for All. They try to imagine by, academic in Israeli universities, that some now call to boycott. They try to imagine Palestinian and Jewish Israeli. They try to imagine a land for all. And here in Vancouver, there's, if you want to also, they have really good food. There is Bar Haifa, which is a restaurant that was created by a Palestinian and Israeli. So there is ways in which I think we can foster education that leads to hope and see people as humans and strive for recognition of suffering and humanity. And I think this needs to be centered in EDI discourses. And I think the lack of addressing antisemitism and the way that it is being, it's not even just the omission of antisemitism, it's also how those EDI discourses can feed into new forms of antisemitism. I think this is something that all of us, should worry about as we, educate people that we hope will make the world a better place. So I will end it here and happy to answer questions.